All right, welcome back to our Bible study on Genesis. Today we're starting with chapter 34. And just a reminder, because I know we didn't have Bible study last week, and I apologize for that and for the lack of notice of the cancellation. So please forgive me. But last time when we left off, Jacob was getting ready to meet his brother Esau, and he wrestles the stranger, who of course is God, as God names, and God changes Jacob's name to Israel, which means you have wrestled with God and prevailed. So that's where we left off, and now Jacob has a limp because God dislocates his hip bone, and so now that's where we left off with Jacob, where he's about to meet his brother Esau, and of course we know the backstory between those two is that Jacob stole the birthright. Jacob stole the blessing, Isaac's blessing from Esau that was rightfully his, based on the family customs of that time. And Esau wanted to kill Jacob, and that's why he went and fled to begin with. And now the time has come for the two to meet once again. So we'll begin in chapter 34. Chapter 33. Sorry, forgive me. So we're in chapter 33. And I'll just start reading here. Now Jacob lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau his brother was coming, and 400 men with him. Now, if you remember the plan, Jacob's plan is that when Esau comes, he's going to send ahead of him. He's going to send his servants with gifts. He's going to send his family members, his children ahead to give gifts to Esau to kind of soften his heart by basically by offering him many gifts, so that he won't want to kill Jacob, and then Jacob will be the last one. And Jacob separates his family into basically two camps, so that if Esau attacks his family, at least half of them can escape. So that's Jacob's game plan as he prepares to meet him, and now he sees that Esau is on the way. So Jacob divided the children among Leah, Rachel, and the two maidservants. Then he put the maidservants and their sons in front, Leah and her children behind, and Rachel and Joseph last. So even in the way he orders his family, it's kind of like from least loved to the most loved, right? Like the maidservants who bear his children are still not his wives. They're not a wife status. So they go up front with those children. And then after that is Leah, who of course Leah was the one that Jacob was tricked into marrying first with her children. And then last but not least is Rachel, who's actually his beloved, and her only son at this point, Joseph. They're going to be last in line. Because if any evil befalls them, the people in the front of the line, then maybe they'll be able to escape. In verse 3, he then crossed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. But Esau ran to meet him, embraced him, and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. So we have this plot twist right here. This is not what we were expecting from Esau. Remember, Esau is, he serves his emotions. He's very driven by emotions. He's driven by the moment, instant gratification. He's an angry person. But in this moment, we have Jacob and Esau now coming and embracing one another, and they're weeping together. Then he lifted his eyes and saw the women and children, and said, "Who are these with you?" He replied, "The children God mercifully gave your servant." Then the maidservants came near, they and their children, and bowed down. Leah also came near with her children, and they bowed down. Afterward, Rachel and Joseph came near, and they bowed down. Then Esau said, "What are these things to you, all this company I met?" So he said, "That your servant might find grace in the sight of the Lord." But Esau said, "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." But Jacob replied, "If I have now found grace in your sight, receive the present from my hands, inasmuch as I have seen your face, as though someone might see the face of God, and you were pleased with me. Receive my blessing I brought you, because God has shown me mercy, and I have enough. Thus he urged him, and he took it. So Esau doesn't want the gifts. He says, I don't need them. Keep them. But Jacob, as a sign of goodwill, he forces him basically. He insists. He insists that Esau will take him. So let's kind of dig into what just happened here, because again, it's kind of an unexpected turn of events. So Jacob shows, first of all, he shows great humility into his brother Esau. He shows that, even though everything that had happened, he bows down 7 times before him. He offers him many, many gifts. So Jacob here displays some virtue, some humility towards his brother, being the younger, but also being the son of the birthright and the son of the blessing. He shows humility in offering these things back to Esau, and Esau doesn't, and excuse me, he doesn't hold it over Esau, right? That he doesn't bring it up. He doesn't mention, well, I'm the son of the blessing. I'm the son with the birthright. He doesn't mention it at all. So again, it shows humility on Jacob's part, that in this meeting he really lowers himself, and maybe out of fear, of what Esau would do in his anger, but he chooses to humble himself before Esau and act in that way. He doesn't escalate the situation further. St. John Chrysostom writes that we, the readers of these passages, should also show the same kind of humility. And he writes, when some people are disposed to be hostile towards us, so when people are angry and they want to, act on that anger towards us, let us, instead of adding fuel to their anger, quell their aggression by our great meekness and humility in both word and action, and thus bring healing to their brokenness. What a contrary view to what usually happens, right? I feel like as humankind, for the most part, not always, but when we have an offense against us, we seek retribution. When someone does something against us, we either hold a grudge and that relationship is broken forever, or we seek to get even. And St. John Chrysostom offers the opposite solution, the opposite medicine to that problem. When a relationship is broken by an offense, he says, be meek and humble in everything that you do, and it will heal the situation. It'll heal the brokenness of the other person, because that person is acting out of a place of brokenness, not a place of being whole. So if we want that healing for the other, which should always be our aim when we have interpersonal relationships, we have to, in those situations, even when it's difficult, we have to show meekness and humility. Not that we have to, but that's the better way. That's what he's saying. The better way is to be meek and humble. And of course, it's not easy to do that. We want to stand up for ourselves. We want to stand up for our rights, to stand up for our dignity and our honor. But he's saying that if you want healing, of yourself and of the other person, then we should act with humility. He continues, and he says that a word spoken in meekness quenches a rage flaring more fiercely than a furnace. I'll say that one more time. A word spoken in meekness quenches a rage flaring more fiercely than a furnace. So if someone's really angry at us and we speak with meek words, it will put out that fire. He continues here, St. John writes, fire does not quench fire. This is contrary to nature. So when we fight fire with fire, we get more fire. You don't put out the fire. You get more fire. So this is what we see happening now between Jacob and Esau. And he also, in his commentary on this chapter, he writes that Esau has been transformed clearly, right? That Esau, in these years that have passed, Esau has gone through his own transformation. He's gone through his own process of maturing and of gaining virtue, and he runs to meet his brother and to embrace him and to reconcile together. So just to finish out chapter 33, In verse 12, Esau said, "Let us take our journey. Let us go, and I will go before you." But Jacob said to him, "My Lord knows the children are weak, and the flocks and herds with me are giving birth. If therefore the men should drive them hard one day, all the cattle would die. Let my Lord go on ahead before his servant. I will lead on slowly at a pace the children are able to bear until I come to my Lord in Seir." Then Esau said, "Let me leave with you some of the people with me." But he said, "What need is there? It is enough that I found grace in my Lord's sight." So Jacob there even calls Esau his Lord. So Esau returned that day on his way to Seir. Then Jacob journeyed to Succoth, built houses, and made booths for his cattle. And therefore he called the name of that place Succoth. Then Jacob came safely to Salem, a city of Shechem, in the land of Canaan, where he came from Mesopotamia of Syria. He took up a position in front of the city. He then bought the parcel of land where he pitched his tent from Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 male lambs. There he set up an altar and called on the God of Israel. So in the end, everything ends well between Jacob and Esau, and they go their separate ways once again. But at least there's not such enmity, there's not such contempt between them as there was when they were children, and their father Isaac was, passing out the final blessings. So in chapter 34, we see now what happens to the family while they're in this land of Shechem, and it's they have not a very pleasant experience. So in chapter 34, we begin. Now Dinah, or Dinah, not quite sure what the pronunciation is there, the daughter of Leah, whom she bore to Jacob. You remember that Jacob has all boys except for one daughter. So this is the one daughter, Dinah, or Dinah. And she's Leah's daughter, went out to see the daughters of the land. So she went out of her father's household, and she's journeying through the countryside to see, to meet with the other local women. But when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, was the previous property owner where Jacob just bought the land, this is his son now, a ruler of the land saw her, he took her, lay with her, and violated her. So this is one of those Bible passages that, when I read it, at least, it makes me very uncomfortable. To read about rape in the Bible is not an easy thing. So this horrible thing happens now to Dinah, and she's violated by this prince, basically, of the land. Now his soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, and he loved the young woman and sought to win her heart. Then Shechem spoke to his father Hamor, saying, "Get this young woman as a wife for me." So after he violates her, then he wants to make her his wife. So he does things backwards, and not right at all. But Jacob heard Hamor's son had defiled Dinah his daughter. Now his sons were with his cattle in the field. So Jacob held his peace until they came. Then Hamor, the father of Shechem, went out to Jacob to speak with him. Now the sons of Jacob came in from the field when they heard it, and the men were stunned and extremely grieved, because he had done a disgraceful thing in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, something that should never have happened. But Hamor spoke with them, saying, "My son Shechem is passionately in love with your daughter. Give her to him as a wife. Make marriages with us. Give us your daughters, and take our daughters for your sons. Dwell among us, and behold, the land before you is spacious. Dwell therein and trade, and acquire possessions in it." So now the father comes, the ruler, one of the rulers of the land, comes to make a deal, not deal, but to come to make a marriage agreement so that his son can marry Dinah, whom he just violated. So the family is very upset, obviously, with obvious reason. Now, what's interesting here is this Hamor. He makes a statement here, where he says, make marriages with us. Give us your daughters. Take our daughters for your sons. Dwell among us. Sorry, I lost my place there. Dwell among us, and behold, the land before you is spacious. Now, this basically is going to be a big theme throughout much of the Old Testament, because after the Jews come into the Promised Land, and God tells them that They have to, basically rid the land of their enemies, and he tells them not to intermarry with them. We see that the Jews really struggle with that, and they do not obey God's commandments, and they intermarry with their neighbors who do not worship the one true God. They worship their pagan idols, and it becomes a big problem because the Jews continue to worship those pagan idols too, and obviously they're God's chosen people. So this is it's an important. It kind of sets up that theme that's going to be happening and going through the rest of the Old Testament. And actually, that's one of the when the Jews are in exile, which comes later in the Old Testament. When the Jews are in exile, the Babylonian captivity, that's one of the reasons that, as they rediscover the scriptures and the commandments of God, it's one of the reasons that they discover it has grieved God, that they, married with others, and through that worshipped these pagan idols. And that's a big, big problem. So this proposition now that Hamor is making to Jacob is problematic. So let's see what's going to happen. In verse 11, then Shechem said to her father and her brothers, let me find grace in your eyes, and we will give whatever you ask. Make the dowry as great as you wish, and I will give it. Only give me this young woman as a wife. But the sons of Jacob answered Shechem and Hamor his father, and spoke deceitfully to them, because he had defiled Dinah their sister. So Simeon and Levi, the brothers of Dinah and the sons of Leah, said to them, we cannot do this thing, to give our sister to a man who is uncircumcised, for that would be a reproach to us. So they actually uphold here that standard of not, taking, foreign wives or foreign spouses for themselves. Remember too, that was a problem with Esau, that he took foreign wives as well. I forgot about that. But on this condition, we will consent to you. If you will become as we are, if every male of you is circumcised, then we will give our daughters to you, and we will take your daughters to us, and we will dwell with you, and we will become one people. But if you will not heed us and be circumcised, we will take our daughters and be gone. So they make them a counter offer. Say, well, we can't do that, but if you take on the mark of the covenant, if you are circumcised like we are, then we can do that. We can intermarry with you. But remember, it said in verse verse 13? It says that they're speaking deceitfully to them. So there's a bigger plan at hand here. They're not really interested. They're really not interested in making, intermarrying and with the children of Hamor and the people of Shechem. It's really not in the cards. But in verse 18, we read, now their words pleased Hamor and Shechem, Hamor's son. So the young man did not delay to do the thing, because he delighted in Jacob's daughter. He was the most esteemed of all those in his father's house, and Hamor and Shechem, his son, came to the gate of their city, spoke with the men of their city, saying, these men are at peace with us. Therefore let them dwell in the land and trade in it, for indeed the land is large enough for them. Let us take their daughters as wives, and let us give them our daughters. Only on this condition will the men consent to dwell with us, to be one people. If every male among us is circumcised as they are circumcised, will not their livestock, their property, and every animal of theirs be ours? Only let us consent to them, and they will dwell with us. Thus all who went out of the gate of their city heeded Hamor and Shechem his son. Every male was circumcised in the flesh. So they agreed to it, but for them also, they're viewing it as a business proposition. Like, well, if we go through this thing, even though it's going to be painful, we can have access to their land. We're going to have access to their property. We're going to have access to their herds, whatever they have. That through marriage we can increase our riches. So they see this as an opportunity to kind of grow in their local wealth, and so they agree and they do it. Now, here's where the deceit of Jacob's sons come into play. In verse 25, now it came to pass on the third day, when they were in pain, so they were still recovering from the surgery, so to speak, two sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, and these are the same ones that spoke up and made the offer in the beginning. Dinah's brothers, each took his sword and came boldly upon the city and killed all the males. They also killed Hamor and Shechem his son with the edge of the sword, and took Dinah from Shechem's house and went out. Then the sons of Jacob came upon the slain and plundered the city in which Dinah their sister had been defiled. They took their sheep, their oxen, their donkeys, what was in the city and what was in the field, and took captive all their wives, their children, their servants, and plundered whatever was in the city and in the houses. So for the Shechemites, for the Hivites, this backfires. The plan backfires. And this really becomes a story of revenge for Jacob's sons. So really, to me, this story is a reminder that even though God is working through this family and he's still working for the salvation of humanity, there's still that brokenness, right? We can go all the way back to the first chapters of this book about the fall and about sin entering the world and about how Cain and Abel and all the things that come after that as signs of the brokenness of humanity, after that original fall. And that brokenness has not been healed at this point. Even though this family is blessed by God, even though this family is, the family of the promise, and these 12 sons of Jacob will be the 12 that will become the 12 tribes of Israel, there's still brokenness in them. That this, first of all, there's brokenness in humanity that Shechem defiled Dinah, and then the revenge element and the slaughter of the males of the city again shows the brokenness. It shows that that sin of Adam and Eve that divided mankind is still at play here. It's still rooted in our humanity. Contrast that with Christ, right? Like if Christ is the example of the perfect human, if Christ is the example of what we're supposed to be, look at him on the cross, right? With being arrested, being totally humiliated, being beaten and spit upon, and accused and judged. And what happens? He on the cross and being crucified. What is his response? Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them, for we know not what they do. So we see that at this point in Genesis, humanity hasn't made it back to that original state of grace yet, and they won't until Christ comes. And even then, it'll always be a struggle, right? For us as human beings, it'll always be a struggle. It'll always be a struggle to reach that level of perfection like Christ does. So the story also kind of plays as a little prelude, a little introduction to the sons of Jacob and their character, which will lead us into the Joseph saga, which is what we'll talk about at the end of today's Bible study. So at the end of verse 34, Jacob tells Simeon and Levi that you've caused trouble for me now. And they respond by saying, should we treat our sister like a prostitute? Should we just allow these things to happen? So you can see there that there's this tension of what of the emotions that the brothers are feeling towards their sister and what happened, and also this the tension between the virtue of Christ-like humility and meekness and forgiveness. So even at the end of that chapter there, we see that tension coming through. Now, in chapter 35, I'm just going to kind of summarize a little bit what happens there. In chapter 35, God calls Jacob back to Canaan, which of course is the land of the promise. And he appears to Jacob once again, and he reaffirms the blessing and the covenant. So that's not even a double down at this point. It's like the 10th time that he's reaffirmed the covenant with his family. And he tells them that he's going to be with them, that he's going to make his descendants, numerous nations, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So basically to encourage him and strengthen him, because what's going to happen in the next part of the book of Genesis is that God will call them out of Canaan once again with a famine, and they will all end up in Egypt. So God reaffirms this covenant at a time just before they will actually be removed once again by the will of God from this land to go to Egypt. It's a reminder for them that even when they're in Egypt, that's not the land of the promise. The land of the promise is Canaan. So God reaffirms it at actually a very um, critical time, a very fragile time in the history of this family, in the history of Israel. And it serves as a reminder for them that no matter where they go, that land where in Canaan is where they're supposed to go. In chapter 35, we also hear of the death of Rachel. So I'll it's a short passage, so I'll just read this really quickly. So Jacob departed from Bethel, and when there was but a little distance to go to Ephrath, so he's being a nomad, he's changing places within Canaan. Rachel labored with much difficulty in childbirth. Now it came to pass when she was in hard labor that the midwife said to her, "Take courage, you will have this son also." So she's giving birth now to her second son. Remember, her only son so far has been Joseph. So now she's in childbirth, and it's very difficult delivery, and she's about to give birth to her second son. So it was as her soul was departing, for she died, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. Thus Rachel died and was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. Then Jacob set a pillar on her grave, which is the pillar of Rachel's grave to this day. So Rachel, sadly, Jacob's beloved Rachel departs this life in childbirth. She gives birth to Jacob's 12th son, whose name is Benjamin, and that kind of completes that's the last one. That's the last child that Jacob's going to have, and his sons will be the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. So Jacob continues to travel around, to be a nomad, and he's going from place to place. And at the end of chapter 35, Isaac also dies. He departs this life. He dies. He's 180 years old when he takes his final breath. And Jacob and Esau come together and bury him. So that takes us to the end of chapter 35. Chapter 36 is a list of genealogies of the family of Esau, and also a list of kings of the local tribes. So I'm not going to go over that. If you'd like to read that on your own, please feel free. We're going to go into Genesis 37, which is where we get into the story of Joseph. And this is really going to be the final saga of the Genesis story. So in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we've looked at kind of the prehistory. We looked at the the universal stories and the universal mythology. Of course, we talked a lot about what that word means when we use it in this type of setting. Not made up stories, but stories that were fundamental in the understanding of the people of the time to how the world worked and what the actions of God were in the creation of the world. All the way through the flood. That's kind of the first section, from the creation of the world to the flood. That's section 1. Then we have from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob is section 2. And the last section is really the saga of Joseph and what happens with Joseph throughout his life. So the story of Joseph will actually take us pretty much through to the end of Genesis, and will lead us into the book of Exodus. So it's a long story. If you look, it starts in verse 37, and if I'm not mistaken, Genesis has 50 chapters. So it's a good 13, 14 chapter jaunt through the story of Joseph and what happens to him. So let's get into it. We're now in chapter 37 of Genesis. Now Jacob dwelt in the land where his father had sojourned, in the land of Canaan. So he's still in the promised land. This is the genealogy of Jacob. Joseph being 17 years old. So we meet Joseph and he's 17. So he's reaching adulthood. He's reaching young adulthood at this point. And he was shepherding the sheep with his brothers. Now he's one of the younger brothers, remember. He's not the youngest, but he's one of the younger ones. Now the lad was with the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. So they're not his wife legally, but they're his wives, maidservants that were the mothers of some of his children. Now, wrong verse. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to his father. So Joseph he's telling his father that they're not behaving well. He's telling them all the bad things that they're doing. Now Israel, meaning Jacob, remember this is the new name given to him by God. Now Israel loved Joseph more than all his sons because he was the son of his old age. Joseph was the son that he was waiting for because he's the first son of Rachel, his beloved. And they had tried for many years to have children, and they were not able until finally Joseph came along. So this was the son basically that he was waiting for with his beloved wife Rachel. So he loves Joseph because it says he's the son of his old age. And they had to wait a long time for him. We can also look to St. John Chrysostom writes about how he loves Joseph because Joseph is virtuous, even from a young age. And we'll see throughout the pages of this story, Joseph shows a lot of virtue. He shows a lot of grace and maturity in the face of some very difficult situations. So he is the favorite. He's the favorite son. And that's important. That'll play here in this chapter. Now, so Israel loved Joseph more than all sons. He also made him a tunic of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak civilly to him. So here we have that enmity coming up again between brothers, the same thing that happened between Jacob and Esau. Now it's happening between Joseph and his brothers because they all can see that Jacob likes Joseph the most. He likes him better than the other brothers. And he makes him this beautiful coat with many colors. If you're familiar with musicals, obviously Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat is the same thing that we're talking about. If you're not familiar with the text of Genesis, that might be the only thing from the Joseph story that you know because of the show. But you'll see that it plays a kind of a small part really in the overarching story of Joseph. Now, the multicolored coat is interesting because at that time, to have fabrics that were dyed colors, right? To have fabrics that were colored like that would have been very expensive. So to have a coat with many colors is kind of an extravagant, expensive gift for a father to give his son. And again, for him to give it to one of the younger children and not to the oldest, who's the son of the birthright, would have been a statement. And that's why the brothers are not really disposed favorably towards Joseph. So we'll see that it's going to cause some trouble for him. Joseph, another thing that we need to know about Joseph is that he has dreams. He has dreams and he interprets dreams. So this is the first dream that he has. So in verse 5, Joseph had a dream and reported it to his brothers. So he has a dream and now he tells his brothers what the dream is. Thus he said to them, "Hear this dream I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Then behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and indeed your sheaves stood all around and bowed down to my sheaf. So his brothers said to him, Shall you indeed reign over us? Or shall you indeed have dominion over us? So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words." So he doesn't do himself any favors by telling his brothers this vision that he has in his dream, basically that he's going to be someone that his brothers bow down to. Because again, that would have been something that would have been unthinkable for a younger brother to rise up and have dominance over the older brothers. Even though we've seen this, again, we talked about this with Jacob and Esau, even though we've seen this many times in the Bible already. So the brothers, if they didn't like him before, they really don't like him now. Then he dreamed still another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Look, I have dreamed another dream, and this time the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars bowed down to me." So he told it to his father and his brothers, and his father rebuked him and said to him, "What is this dream you have dreamed? Shall your mother and I and your brothers indeed come and bow down on the ground before you?" And his brothers envied him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So Jacob rebukes Joseph. Israel rebukes Joseph here and says, basically, for the same reasons that the brothers are angry at him, do you really expect that we're going to bow down to you? Because again, culturally speaking, that would have been something unthinkable, especially for a father, father and mother, leaders of the household, to bow down to one of their younger children. It's kind of a bold statement to make. So the brothers are all very, very envious of him. St. John Chrysostom writes about envy extensively. He says that envy does not leave the soul until it leaves it in a very bad state. When we are envious and try to harm the person we are envying, they come out the better and we the worse. So he writes about envy being a destructive force, about how it destroys. When we have envy, it destroys us. It doesn't harm the other person. It's a passion where we literally destroy ourselves being envious of someone else, and they usually end up the better and we the worse. So this is the state the brothers find themselves in now. They're very upset. So let's see what they're going to do. So in verse 12, then his brothers went to feed their father's flock in Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, are not your brothers shepherding the sheep in Shechem? Come, I will send you to them. So many times when the shepherds would go out with the flocks for them to graze, they would be gone for days at a time. So Israel here is sending Joseph to get news, to get news from them to make sure that they're okay. So he said to him, Joseph says to Israel, here I am, meaning I'll go. Then Israel said to him, go and see if it is well with your brothers and well with the sheep, and bring back word to me. So he sent him out of the valley of Hebron, and he went to Shechem. So this is a reconnaissance mission. He's looking for information, how the brothers are doing, and how the flocks are doing. So he, in the next few verses, Joseph inquires of someone, and the stranger directs him to his brothers in Dothan. Dothan is a place nearby. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them in Dothan. Now when they saw him far off, even before he came near them, they conspired against him to kill him. So the brothers have had enough, and they're ready to take action. They want to kill him. Then they said to one another, look, this dreamer is coming. Come therefore, let us now kill him and cast him into some pit. And we shall say, some wild beast has devoured him. We shall see what will become of his dreams. So that last line is mockingly, right? They say that mockingly. Oh, we'll see if this guy's dreams come true now, right? So they're plotting to kill him. They're going to throw him in a pit and say that a wild animal ate him, because the evidence would be gone at that point. They can make any claim that they want. If an animal ate him, there's nothing left of him to prove them right or wrong. But Reuben heard it and delivered him out of their hands and said, let us not kill him. Again, Reuben said to them, shed no blood, but cast him into this pit in the desert. Do not lay a hand on him, that he might deliver him out of their hands and bring him back to his father. So Reuben does not share their desire to kill Joseph. And he says, well, okay, why don't we throw him in the pit and just not touch him, not do anything? And really what Reuben's doing here is he's hoping that as cooler heads prevail, he can go and get him out of the pit and take him back home safe and sound. So that's his plan. So now he's trying to divert their rage, instead of killing him, to just throw him into the pit and just leave him there for a little while. So now we're in verse 23. So it came to pass when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped the tunic of many colors off him. Then they took him and cast him into a pit which was empty, for there was no water in it. So they throw him into, you can picture it like a dry well. They throw him down into this pit that he cannot get out of. There's no way he can get out of it. So Reuben's plan works so far, that he's in the pit and he's not dead. So that's good. Reuben wants to bring him home. Then they sat down to eat a meal. So after throwing their brother in a pit and leaving him there, they sit down to eat. Just a funny image, right? Only funny because we know that in the end it's going to work out. But it's like, oh, I'm glad that's over. Let's eat. I'm hungry. And they lifted their eyes and looked, and there was a company of Ishmaelite wayfarers coming from Gilead with their camels, bearing spices, balm, and myrrh on their way to carry them down to Egypt. So they see this caravan coming, carrying their goods, going down to Egypt. So Judah said to his brothers, what profit is there if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites, but let not our hand be upon him, for he is our brother and our flesh. And his brothers listened. So it seems like Reuben's plan worked. Cooler heads prevail. Here Judah says, well, let's not kill him because he's our brother. We saw how that worked with Cain and Abel. But let's sell him now into slavery so we can be rid of him, but then his blood won't be on our hands. Thus the Midianite traders passed by, and the brothers pulled Joseph up and lifted him out of the pit, and they sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of gold. So they took Joseph to Egypt. Then Reuben returned to the pit. So Reuben had gone. He wasn't with the group at this time. Then Reuben returned to the pit, and when he saw Joseph was not in there, he tore his clothes. And that was a sign of great sorrow when they tore their clothes. When you read that, tearing your clothes is a sign of being sorrow, bitterly sorrow. So he returned to his brothers and said, "The lad is not there, and I, where shall I go?" So Joseph is sold into slavery for 20 pieces of gold. You have kind of that mirroring of the arrest of Christ. Judas sells Jesus out to the Pharisees for 30 pieces of silver. And so we have kind of that parallel, and you'll see there's many other parallels too with the Joseph and Jesus. And we'll talk about that as we get more into the narrative. So now he's on his way to Egypt with this caravan. But now the brothers have to explain it to their father. They have to explain what happened. They can't just go back without Joseph, right? They have to have an explanation. So let's see what plan they concoct. Thus they took Joseph's tunic, killed a kid of the goats, and dipped the tunic in the blood. Then they sent the tunic of many colors and had it brought to their father and said, "We found this. Do you know whether it is your son's tunic or not?" So obviously they know whose tunic it is, right? Obviously they know that it's Joseph's tunic. They dip it in animal blood from one of the goats to make it look like it's Joseph's blood. And they show it to their father and say, "Hey, do you know whose coat this is?" And knowing obviously that he would know that it's Joseph's. So he recognized it and said, "This is my son's tunic. A wild animal has devoured Joseph and carried him off." So the thing that they wanted their father to believe, he believes, and he says it himself. The brothers did it in such a conniving way to make it seem like, oh, they had no idea what had happened. They just found the tunic. Then Jacob tore his clothes. There you have that again, and put sackcloth on his waist and mourned for his son many days. Which, if you think about it, really, if the brothers, right? If you're the brothers, that's really messed up. Like your father's beloved son, you fake it, you sell him into slavery, fake his death, and you allow your father to mourn for him for like many days. That's just bad. That's just not good at all. Thus all his sons and daughters arose to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted. And he said, "I shall go down into the grave to my son in mourning." So his father wept for him. Now the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard. So Joseph goes down to Egypt, and he is sold into the service of one of the leaders of Egypt, whose name is Potiphar. So that's where we will leave off today, at the end of chapter 37 of Genesis, with the beginning stages of the Joseph saga. At this point, if anyone has any questions they want to ask, feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question. And if not, then we will depart for the evening. Going once, going twice. Okay, sounds good, guys. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We will continue next week with our look at Genesis, and we'll go from there. We'll have about, I think, 13 chapters left, so we're getting to the end. We'll have maybe four more sessions before we reach the end, and then we'll take a little break with Bible study and decide what we want to do next. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for your participation and your attentiveness. And may God bless you all and be with you. Thank you. Have a beautiful night.
Thank you, Father. Good night.